Everyone, and thank you for joining us for our latest Lunch and Learn program. This one is titled The History of Human Rights. My name is Sara Brown, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education, so change with 2 H's, and I am going to be leading today's Lunch and Learn. First of all, just thank you all for joining me. Our programming occurs because of the generosity of our members and also our supporters and participants like you. So thank you for being here and thank you for your continued support. Please consider joining Change as a member if you are not already a member. And if you are interested, just visit our website, which is change.org. Again, change with 2 H's. And you can sign up or you can reach out to one of us after the program and we will happily get that taken care of. I have a couple of housekeeping items just pertaining to today's Lunch and Learn. Your audio is muted upon entry, so don't be surprised that when you come on, you're automatically muted. The chat feature is also disabled. But at the end of the presentation, once I'm done speaking, we're going to open it back up because we want it to be a bit of a dialogue. And so if you have any questions, please then add them into the chat box, type them into the chat box, or if your video is enabled, just raise your hand and we will try to get to you and look forward to having a really engaging discussion. Also, don't worry if you missed something in the beginning or you missed a detail or you didn't quite catch the language on one of the slides. Don't worry about any of that because after this session, we're going to send you an email with a list of additional resources as well as a link to our YouTube channel where we will have this webinar as well as on our website. Okay, housekeeping items all done. Now we can move on to the program. Today we are going to explore really an altogether 2 brief history of the evolution of human rights, as well as the international legal mechanisms that have been created to protect human rights. We're also going to talk a little bit about more modern human rights abuses, including genocide. Now, whenever relevant, I am also going to weave in a bit about the United States, and then towards the end, I'll also share a little bit of my personal experiences. But what are we talking about? What is what are human rights? What are we talking about so that we just all know exactly where I'm coming from when I talk about human rights? You know, these are sometimes known as natural rights or the rights of man and woman. Human rights are entitlements that we are guaranteed as human beings just by virtue of being human beings. They include in very broad strokes whatever it takes for us to survive and survive with dignity. They also, over the past 800 years or so, give or take, have evolved dramatically. Our understanding and also our enjoyment of these rights have evolved very dramatically. Now, I say 800 years because today we're going to open our history of human rights with the Magna Carta of 1215. Now, that means that I'm also leaving aside all of the prominent religions that played a significant role in the development of human rights. I'm also leaving aside our many philosophers, the role of ancient and more modern philosophers who have helped to shape this understanding of ethics, morality, the rights of man, the social contract. I'm leaving all of that aside. We don't have all day. And so we're going to stick to a couple of really key historic documents and then move on up to more modern times. Okay, so what is the Magna Carta? Well, it's a very long document that deals primarily with the horrible reign of a king in England known as King John. He had been in power for 16 years by the time the Magna Carta was actually forced upon him, and none of those 16 years was very pretty. He is often referred to as the worst king in British history, and trust me, he deserves that designation. The Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was drafted by the barons, or British nobility landowners in England, and they drafted it in order to limit the powers and excesses of King John. King John was, of course, not interested in reigning in his powers, so the barons captured London, held it under siege, and eventually forced him to accept the Magna Carta under duress. Now, the Magna Carta itself tackles a myriad of rights. It covers land ownership and taxes, royal servants, all these other things that really don't have a ton of relevance today. But there is one clause. It is referred to as the 39th clause, and you actually can see it here listed on the slide. This is the most famous and the most enduring line from the Magna Carta, and it's still even a part of law today in England. Clause 39 gives all free men the right to justice and a fair trial. Now, that was a major step forward for the times, because at the time, King John was taking land whenever he saw fit. He was incarcerating and oftentimes killing various landowners. He was imposing hefty taxes. And so this idea of the right to a free and fair trial before your peers is actually quite revolutionary. But, and I want to insert this, but this is a great step forward, but a quick note about England in 1215. In reality, because the right to justice and a fair trial only applied to those free men, it doesn't really benefit the majority of England. We have women who are very clearly ignored, and the vast majority of medieval England was comprised of peasants, and they are not considered free. They were ruled by the landowners at the time. So this does benefit a very slim margin of society. Even so, it marks this significant milestone. And over 800 years later, the Magna Carta has become a lasting symbol and example of many of the history-altering documents that we're going to discuss today. Now, jumping ahead over 400 years, we come to the Treaty of Westphalia, which is also known as the Peace of Westphalia. By 1648, the 30 Years' War had led to tremendous destruction in Central Europe. And it's really, at this point, it's not even a war, it's a series of wars. It began initially as a struggle between Protestants and Catholics, but over time it had expanded. Several of the great powers of that time had gotten involved. There was a ton of land grabbing, but the main theme of Protestant versus Catholic still remained. Among other things, the Treaty of Westphalia brought about an end to the war, which, you know, is tremendous, but its lasting significance is actually that it explicitly protected religious rights. And you can see a portion of the document there on the slide. It protected, well, in so much as it protected really the Protestants from the Catholics, but it explicitly talks about without distinction of religion. And this is really important. Another key component of the Treaty of Westphalia is that it addresses state sovereignty and ensured that nation states at the time could exercise autonomous control over their territories. Now, in theory, these are both really key rights, but in practice, the groundbreaking impact of state sovereignty and this practice of non-interference in another country's domestic affairs, unfortunately, has meant that human rights abuses, be them religious-based or otherwise, are often overlooked. This is because the primacy is instead placed on state sovereignty over that of human rights, and this has been a consistent theme that has lasted ever since, and something that we will get into in a little bit more later. Now, jumping ahead another 100+ years, some of the Magna Carta and the Peace of Westphalia's core principles are echoed in the United States Bill of Rights from 1971. Now, the Bill of Rights was completed, it was introduced earlier, but completed and agreed upon in 1791. And it includes 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. And these lay out some very specific rights. And I summarize them briefly in my own words there on the slide, what the first through 10th all enumerate. Fun fact though, there were actually 12 amendments that were initially proposed, though only 10 were passed. One of the ones that was at the time rejected later on became the 27th Amendment. Now, these amendments were viewed as necessary after so much debate and distress over the drafting of the Constitution and eventual passage of the Constitution. Those who opposed granting the federal government so many sweeping powers were supposed to be mollified by these amendments, which focus very specifically and deliberately on individual rights and set boundaries. They limit federal power. This is, again, another step forward. This is a tremendous step forward, and by a fledgling democracy at the time, so it's very significant. At the same time, and I'm going to keep inserting these buts here and there, this is a big one. It doesn't apply to everyone. Quite a few people are missing, actually, in these broad and grand and very noble rights that are being guaranteed. Women are not guaranteed these rights. African Americans are not guaranteed these rights. Indigenous persons are not guaranteed these rights. And the landless are not guaranteed these rights. So again, we see this tremendous document, this great step forward, but it's really only benefiting a slim margin of society at the time. Still, even as the United States was denying rights to its own people, it was influencing human rights over in Europe. We have the founding father, who is a devout anti-federalist, and at the time was the US envoy to France. This is Thomas Jefferson, of course, who actually consulted on the drafting of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen back in 1789. So we start to see actually this cross-pollination of human rights norms and discourse, and the idea of enumerating these individual rights that is taking place on both sides of the so-called pond. And this is a really interesting time where we start to see the idea of these rights expanding and extending beyond the boundaries of a state and going out into the broader international discourse. Our skip through history now brings us to 1859 and the Battle of Solferino. It was there that Henry Dunant, a traveling merchant, witnessed the horrors of war and the deplorable state of the wounded in the battlefield. Dunant witnessed the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino, and he did his best to try to help those who were wounded, but it wasn't enough. He then went on to found the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and influenced the Swiss government to host a conference that resulted in the drafting of the first Geneva Convention. This convention is now a staple in international humanitarian law, and these are the laws that govern armed conflict. The convention initially drafted and passed, as you see here. It was, covered, I think, maybe 3 main points, but passed in 1864. This went through a number of versions before it was eventually codified. And it became one of what we now know as the 4 Geneva Conventions that were adopted in 1949. But that first Geneva Convention is incredibly important because it was the first treaty of its kind that codified the idea that there are certain rules and rights that are guaranteed to armed combatants. It ensured that medical care and relief for the wounded would occur without any distinction as to nationality. So it didn't matter who you were on the battlefield, you had a right to medical care. It also stipulated that there would be neutrality for all of the medical personnel and medical establishments and units that were out there caring for the wounded. And it also established the sign of the Red Cross on a white background as the symbol for those neutral medical personnel who were to be exempt from all of the hostilities. So if you were wearing that on your clothes as an armband or across your chest or on your back, that meant that you were neutral and you should not be targeted in the midst of a conflict. By the way, there are also now other signs that are internationally recognized. This includes the non-denominational diamond. There is a red diamond on a white background. The Magen David or Jewish star, and also the Red Crescent are some of the ones that are commonly used around the world. Now, here we begin to see the beginnings of international, not just local, not just national or regional, but international instruments that are dedicated to ensuring human rights. The trouble here, and again, I'm going to keep inserting these buts, is that these were really restricted to the rights of combatants during conflict. And so we don't see civilians receiving much mention. They're largely ignored. And at the time really fell under this idea of the spoils of war. And more recently, in more modern history, I'd say the last century or so, it's a fact that civilians are now targeted more and more frequently and often deliberately as part of military strategy during armed conflict. So the 4 Geneva Conventions, this first one, tremendous step forward, but we do have this issue where we see that it was limited at the time to strictly armed combatants. Now we skip ahead a few more decades to the founding of the League of Nations in 1920. It was formed following the devastation of World War I, and it was dedicated to preserving peace across states or between states. Interestingly, and I list a lot of language here just to kind of show you just how broad the initial founding covenant was, but interestingly, human rights are not mentioned anywhere in this founding covenant. And, you know, the language on the slide there, it's all lovely and the intention is good, but unfortunately, I'm including the League of Nations here as an example in our history where we missed an opportunity. It's also an indication, though, of where the major powers were at in the early 20th century. Human rights was not front and center at that point. Now, the League of Nations, interestingly, was proposed and greatly promoted by then US President Woodrow Wilson. This was part of his peace plan for Europe, but he faced incredible pressure back in the United States. Many opposed the idea of subjecting the United States to the rule of the League of Nations. They felt that it would in some way limit the sovereignty of the United States. So in the end, the United States did not officially join the League of Nations, and the League of Nations itself in its design really lacked enforcement mechanisms to ensure that, that there was a lasting peace among states. In the end, it really failed spectacularly. And it's not just, I mean, leading up to the Holocaust, there were a number of failures. The body did little to stop Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. It did very little to intervene in the Spanish Civil War. We have Japan's invasion of China, and then Hitler's initial occupation of the Sudetenland in Austria. World War II and the Holocaust, unfortunately, soon followed. Now, World War II and the Holocaust do certainly change things, and they really mark a turning point in human history and also in this effort to both codify and ensure human rights. By the early 1940s, international human rights are now on the minds of many, and various efforts are made to delineate and codify these rights that are inherent to each individual. These are being drafted both in the United States and abroad, and this interest and this pressure resulted in a noticeable shift in what we see as the Charter of the United Nations. And there I have a little bit of the opening text of the preamble to the United Nations, as well as the initial document, this idea of we the people of the United Nations. The symbol of the UN is here, but also you see a photograph from when we were invited to the United Nations to speak and participate in a panel back in January. So the Charter of the United Nations, it's signed in June of 1945 in San Francisco, and it eventually comes into force that October. How many times do you think human rights ended up being mentioned just in this charter? A total of 7 times. And the charter mandated that the United Nations set up a Human Rights Commission that would go on to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the next topic on our slide. So here we really see that there is a there's a change in the wind, so to speak, especially when you mark the change of where the major powers were at during the drafting of the League of Nations covenant and where they are at when they're drafting the Charter for the United Nations. What eventually became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is this massive undertaking. You know, for the first time ever, states around the globe were planning, intending to draft and pass an internationally agreed upon document that would articulate the rights for each and every human being. It's a massive undertaking. Now, in the end, 18 of the then 56 member states to the United Nations were assigned to the Human Rights Commission. And to be perfectly honest, challenges immediately emerged. There were philosophical divisions, East versus West, and then everything in between. There were political divisions because this is as communism versus liberal democracy is taking center stage in the beginnings of the Cold War. We see power divisions as well, the so-called developed world versus the developing world, often referred to now as the global North versus the global South. In addition, this is 1945 through 1948. This is kind of the period of the drafting, really 1946 to 48. Many people are still colonized around the globe, and they're unable to weigh in as states, as member states. So there are problems from the outset. Still, somehow, the drafting process for the UDHR was largely inclusive. There were comments and edits that were made by the original authors, the Commission, and the General Assembly of the United Nations. In addition, you have a number of special interest groups and organizations weighing in, offering edits, offering their own versions of drafts, and helping to influence the drafting process. everyone contributed. And despite how difficult the process may have proven getting everybody on board, this really does give the document the universal legitimacy that it still enjoys today. Now, why, by the way, is Eleanor Roosevelt's photograph featured here? That's because she played an instrumental role not only in the development of the United Nations, but also she chaired the commission that drafted the UDHR. She was one of the few diplomats at the time who was really known and trusted and respected by all sides, and thus she was able to broker many concessions and agreements on many aspects of what eventually comprised the UDHR. Now, the then president of the General Assembly, and this was at the time the president of Australia, he went on to note that this was the first occasion on which the organized community of nations had made a declaration of human rights and fundamental rights. That is not a light thing. That is a massive, massive achievement. The preamble to the UDHR stipulates that everyone has a right to freedom, justice, and peace in the world. It also covers all aspects of human security in its 30 articles. It binds together both the basic socioeconomic needs and civil political fundamental rights. It ensures that individuals enjoy rights and are spared from threats, both within and also outside of the borders of the country that they inhabit. It covers such a broad spectrum, from freedom from slavery to freedom from torture, the right to asylum, the right to marriage, the right to a nationality, the right to education, the right to freedom of belief, the right from state and personal interference. It's this incredibly expansive document. It really captures the full spectrum of rights that you need to live and live with dignity in its 30 articles. Now, in the end, 8 countries did abstain from voting on the passage of UDHR, but it was passed. I will note that the 8 states, 6 of them were from the communist bloc. The other one was South Africa, which at the time was implementing the apartheid, and there was tremendous racial inequality, and there was also a dispute over the treatment of the Indians living in South Africa. And then also the 8th state was Saudi Arabia, which objected to the right to religion and the right to marriage. But, and this is a big but, the UDHR was intended as a covenant. And eventually it was whittled down to a declaration. It's not the Universal Covenant of Human Rights, it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is a big difference. A covenant is a binding agreement, whereas a declaration is not. A covenant is thus stronger than a declaration because the countries that sign and ratify a covenant are then legally bound to uphold it. There are several countries that blocked the UDHR from becoming a legally binding covenant. There are 4 in particular that I'll mention: the USSR, the UK, Australia, and the United States, and each for their own reasons. The USSR was not into the economic, social, and cultural rights. The UK and Australia were colonialists. Also, they weren't into the civil and political rights. There were many problems on that front. The UK and Australia were colonizing people, and so of course they were not interested in this being a legally binding covenant. And here in the United States, the country was worried about some of the political rights given the suppression of minorities throughout America and the gross human rights atrocities that were taking place in the Jim Crow South. Now, the good news is that over time, even though the UDHR was passed as a declaration and not a covenant, it has been utilized by international legal mechanisms as a form of what is called customary international law. And that means that it represents overriding international norms and customs, and therefore is actually a part of international law. And eventually, the UDHR led to 2 legally binding covenants that entered into force in 1976 that build off of those initial 30 articles. Those are the ICCPR, or International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the ICESCR, it's like alphabet soup, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, 1945 really marked a turning point in history with the creation of the United Nations, the subsequent drafting and passing of the UDHR, and this all signals that there is a new international norm in place where we are no longer going to ignore human rights. But there's theory and then there's practice. So here's where we're going to take a slight turn and not just speak of historic milestones, but reflect on the impact and the legacy of several specific human rights related conventions. The first one is going to be the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This one is in particular near and dear to my heart. And this convention, it introduces, it defines, and it criminalizes genocide, being the intent to destroy in whole or in part a people based on their religion, their ethnicity, their nationality, or their race. And honestly, there should be other groups that were involved in there, but you know what? Let's leave the drafting of and passing of that particular convention for an entirely separate lunch and learn that I'll happily give down the road. Now, genocide is a term that was coined by Polish lawyer and human rights advocate Raphael Lemkin, and he's featured here on the slide. He actually introduced the term well before the Holocaust, and he used it initially to describe the Armenian genocide. But it was only after surviving the Holocaust, he himself survived the Holocaust, he was forced to flee, he came to the United States, he lost many family members, but it was only after the Holocaust that the international community was really ready to entertain this term and also make it illegal and punishable according to international law. But as we have seen time and time again, codifying and making illegal a crime does not prevent its occurrence, and it must be enforced. And here again, we see this post-Westphalian reverence for sovereignty come into conflict with human rights norms. Because despite the existence of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and other mass atrocities over the past 8 decades since the Genocide Convention was drafted, and also despite its existence across continents, it's not limited to one continent, we see over and over again that countries and the international community rarely intervene. Now, I was in middle school when the genocide in Rwanda occurred, and I wasn't following the news. I had no idea that the United States spent months playing word gymnastics about the G word, worried that if they called what was taking place in Rwanda a genocide, it would somehow require them to intervene. All the while, over 1 million individuals, Tutsis and Hutu moderates, were being systematically hunted, tortured, raped, and murdered as part of an orchestrated genocide. And it wasn't until I was in college and I learned about the details of what had transpired in 1994 and also learned about the role of the United States. Now, personally, I had known quite a bit about the Holocaust growing up. I'd been learning about it since I was a child, and I had at the time, perhaps naively, thought that when the world said never again, that they had meant it. I also believed that when the United States had finally, and I say finally because it took the United States 4 decades and over 3,000 speeches by one particular senator, Senator Proxmire, but when the United States had finally passed the Proxmire Act to implement the Genocide Convention back in 1988, that the United States government had meant it. And then I was to realize that that wasn't the case, and it was, not to be dramatic, but it was really a shattering moment for me. Fast forward a few years, and I went to Rwanda as a volunteer intern. It was my first trip to the continent, and I arrived with no idea what to expect and honestly way too much luggage. I was tasked by a small NGO at the time with developing and delivering a training about the 1948 Genocide Convention. And I was to deliver this to the newly formed Gacaca Court personnel. Now, the Gacaca courts were these hybrid courts that were charged with trying, in the end, nearly 2 million crimes of genocide and over 1 million people accused of perpetrating those crimes. It's a massive task, and I was there pretty much at the outset, just as they were inaugurating the courts. And I was being asked to teach the court personnel about this international mechanism behind the term and definition of the very word genocide. No big deal, right? I mean, I still wonder about whether or not that was their wisest choice to task me with it. But here's the thing. Some of the people that I did train back in 2004 didn't realize that this international mechanism even existed. And that in fact, genocide was even illegal according to international law, and that so many other groups had experienced genocide since the convention had been drafted and entered into force. And they were fascinated by this, but also fascinated by me. Over and over in these trainings, I kept hearing, why was a white American in Rwanda doing this training? Why was I even there? And the Q&A sessions, this is back in 2004, I think in the subsequent years, many more, especially expatriates, got involved in Rwanda and joined these NGOs. But back then, it was a little bit more of an anomaly. These Q&A sessions kind of rapidly would turn into these personal interrogations. And I found myself explaining over and over again my background and how I had lost family members during the Holocaust. And I'm saying all of this to share this one moment that has stuck with me since. When one of the people in the training looked to me and said, "Oh, then of course you understand. You're a survivor just like us." And the idea that genocide could offer a bond, a shared suffering, and with it this shared understanding that even communicates across generations, this really saddens me. To this day, it saddens me. And genocide continues to occur. We as a community have yet to ascertain the right combination, I guess, of criteria that will compel the international community to more broadly intervene in a meaningful way when such gross human rights abuses are taking place. Now, political will, of course, is a determining factor, but so too, it seems, is the existence of a threat to peace, to trade, to stability that extends beyond the borders of the country in which the actual human rights abuses are taking place and instead threatens others. So unfortunately, the criteria doesn't seem to be that people are suffering. That isn't enough. There must be something more at stake, unfortunately. And now the last, for now, convention that I want to unpack with you is the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. This too was shaped by the Holocaust and the plight of refugees throughout Europe, and it defines who constitutes a refugee and also asylum seekers. But it defines refugees as people who flee their country owing to a well-founded fear of persecution or are without nationality. This means that they were stripped of it or denied it by their home country. It also lists the rights that refugees are supposed to enjoy, and in particular, it ensures that they are protected not only as they flee, but in the country where they end up. Now, as of the end of 2019, over 79 million people are forcibly displaced around the world. According to the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, about 26 million of those displaced persons are refugees. And then there are another about 45 or more million who are internally displaced and others, asylum seekers and others. Now, of the 26 million who constitute this refugee population, more than half of them, it is estimated, are under the age of 18. So they're minors, they're youths. And many of them live in refugee camps that are organized and maintained by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And when I was 24 years old, I moved to Tanzania to work in 4 of these camps along the Tanzania-Burundi border. My position was with an international organization known as Right to Play. It is a tremendous organization that at the time was active in 24 different countries, providing sport and play opportunities for youth living in underdeveloped urban settings, displaced person camps, and refugee camps. And the goals were deceptively simple, so to say. They basically to offer youth and youth across a broad spectrum, so children, youth, anyone under the age of 18, an opportunity to engage in activities around sport and play, to promote community empowerment and volunteerism, and to train the older youth on specific sports so that they could take over in our place eventually, thus ensuring some sustainability in the program goals. Now, the people that I worked with were protected by the 1951 Refugee Convention, and there is a specific section of it about non-refoulement, which basically means not forcing refugees or asylum seekers back to a country where they may face persecution. And I want to share a story. I had been in Tanzania for a few months when we received reports of an influx of people seeking safety at a way station along the Burundi border. Way stations are basically processing spaces where people fleeing one country can come into another, and they're interviewed to determine if they meet the criteria to be registered as a refugee or an asylum seeker. And this group was problematic. Burundi was violently unstable at the time, but the seeming cause of this influx of people seemed to be due to food insecurity due to drought conditions in Burundi. So there was a question of, were they there for the right reasons? Was it owing to a well-founded fear of persecution, or because there was food scarcity in their home country? And that would have changed how they were designated and processed and the rights that they would have been able to enjoy. Now, I joined a team of UNHCR staff on a trip out to the way station in order to find out more. Unfortunately, the district commissioner, a Tanzanian man in charge of the region, got there first. And he got up on a podium and he threatened everyone at the way station. And he promised them if they stuck around until tomorrow, he was going to return with his military. By the time we arrived, over 8,000 people were in flight on foot, rushing back to the border, rushing back to cross the border to get back into Burundi. It was a heartbreaking moment to see all of those people fleeing in their minds for their lives. And technically, because the district commissioner had merely threatened them and not actually physically forced them back, there was no recourse for him. He suffered zero consequences. And he was quite pleased with himself for having taken care of this problem. Later on, all of the camps that I worked in, but one, were forcibly closed, and with the blessing of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Those who did not meet the strict criteria for resettlement to a third country were forced back home because the warring parties in Burundi had reached a peace agreement. This, by the way, is the same country where the recent outgoing president, who, as of just a few weeks ago, showed up dead and under questionable circumstances, his name is Pierre Nkurunziza, he had ruled violently since announcing that he was going to run for a third term back in 2015, which was in direct violation of this so-called peace agreement that had been signed all those years ago. And when people began to resist and try to hold him to the peace agreement, he activated a team of youth militia that he referred to as the Imbonerakure in order to enforce his rule, and they began systematically hunting down people based on their ethnicity. But the basic terms, never mind the facts on the ground, but the basic terms of that peace agreement meant that the requirements of the 1951 Refugee Convention had technically been met. There was no longer an active war in Burundi. There was peace in Burundi. And so the Burundian people, whether or not they were in fact safe when they returned, were forcibly returned. Now I want to leave you with a couple of just concluding thoughts because I think that that's a pretty dark way to end a talk. So I'll leave you with this. Human rights atrocities have and continue to occur, and the rights of human beings around the globe continue to be violated. Just this week, we're commemorating 25 years since the genocide at Srebrenica, and the news has also been covering the mass incarceration of and human rights violations against the Uyghurs living in China. But they are reporting on it through the lens of sovereign states. It's about the US versus China, not necessarily about the human rights necessarily that are being violated on the ground. This primacy that is placed on sovereignty post-1648 Treaty of Westphalia continues to impact the evolution of human rights around the globe and throughout more recent history. More broadly, a policy of non-intervention still prevails when it comes to state-perpetrated human rights abuses. And when an intervention occurs, it is often limited, imperfect, or inconsistent. Still, and I promise you there is some good news here, still, the creation and diffusion of these human rights instruments, like the ones that we've mentioned above, and so many others that have come into force since then. We have the 1979 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the 1984 Convention Against Torture, the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child, the 2006 Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. All of these mechanisms, they do constitute progress. And the victims of human rights abuses also have gained historically unprecedented power to make their cases known to the world and also to seek recourse and redress in international, regional, and national courts. That too counts as progress. So this is an evolving and dynamic conversation. I'll give you an example. 30 years ago, were any of us talking about the idea that individuals have rights on the internet? So the last chapter has not yet been written. I think this is going to be an ever-evolving conversation, and there's only room for improvement. Today, over 800 years later, we know and understand that every human being is entitled to rights because they are humans. They are for every human being, and they are inalienable, meaning that they can't be taken away from us. Even if you violate the rights of someone else, you still have rights. So I'll leave you with this final thought. We are all entitled to human rights by virtue of being human, but we don't all equally enjoy those human rights. And some of us who are privileged to have and enjoy certain rights do not always exercise them. For example, the right to vote. Many of our rights come with responsibilities to exercise our rights, to protect the rights of others, to ensure that each of us equally has and enjoys human rights, and also to take meaningful action when human rights are being violated anywhere in the world. As Emma Lazarus once wrote, until we are all free, we are none of us free. Thank you. And now I want to open up our conversation. And I think I will trust, let's see, Nicole or Allie with the task of passing me some questions. Is that possible, or should I try and pull them up? Let's see if I can open up the chat box.
I don't see any questions yet, so if anyone is typing in the chat or wants to raise their hand, I'm happy to pass on the question to Sara.
Yes, don't be shy. I know I just threw an awful lot of information at everyone. And I know I didn't cover it all. I see Lola. Lola, I'm going to try to unmute you. Give me 1 second. Hi, Lola.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the program. I understand that the United Nations is supposed to enforce these rights, but I have read from time to time that they are the worst perpetrators of many of these rights. Rapes, murders, etc., especially through Africa, have occurred through the United Nations envoys. Am I correct?
Unfortunately, Lola, you are correct. And I can speak to my own experience in places where I have worked, and there is a UN, either DPKO presence, which is Department of Peacekeeping Operations, or HCR presence, which is the High Commissioner of Refugees. In both of those instances, pretty much as soon as the contingent was deployed or the sub-office was set up, prostitution spiked and episodes of sexual violence spiked. And there have been an unfortunately disturbing number of reports that have come out of places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in which there have been some very violent acts of sexual violence perpetrated against the very refugees that some of these individuals are tasked with protecting. And so you're right, it's actually been a major issue. The prevalence of just misogyny and sexual violence is something that I believe the UN has tried to take great measures to proactively address, but there's still a tremendous amount to be done, especially when you think about what the blue helmet or the blue symbol is supposed to embody. It's supposed to tell you that you're safe. And in fact, for many, it's cause for flight. And so, yes, that's an unfortunate but very accurate point. Thanks, Lola. Linda asks if separating children from their parents at our borders is a violation of human rights, and what is the recourse that parents may have? Here we're getting into some very nitty-gritty and highly politicized content, but according to the 1951 convention and also other conventions pertaining to the rights of children, yes, this does constitute an international human rights violation. And unfortunately, it's one that I think greatly weakens our position as a country that should be leading on these issues rather than being a primary perpetrator. Anybody have any other questions? To which I also want to ask if Nicole or Allie have any questions, because perhaps they have something they want to contribute to the conversation. I'm absolutely certain I didn't cover it all. Oh, Lola's got a hand up again. Go ahead, Lola. Well, hold on. Yep.
Okay. Talking about our border, of course, Trump, and of course, separating the children from the parents, etc. I have a daughter that lives in San Diego. She says that problem no longer exists. There's nobody trying to cross or nobody as substantial as there was before, even trying to cross the border anymore. It's being enforced. People are not trying because of the virus. And everything that Trump tried to do to date, of course, he was criticized for. And here the problem has gone away. I know it's just a statement, but it's also...
And I was very much hoping that would be a question instead of a statement. But in addressing that statement, thank you, Lola, for contributing that. I want to note that it's not a problem if people are trying to cross a border seeking refuge. That's never a problem. It should never be described as a problem. What is a problem is if they are not allowed due process and protections and rights as guaranteed under the various international mechanisms. And also a problem is the reasons, the underpinning reasons why somebody would flee their home country, their home culture, their home language in order to seek refuge in another country, which is often a tremendous and terrifying undertaking, and something that we have covered in a number of our programs, especially when thinking about the legacy of the Holocaust, but also what happened to the Armenians and people from Bosnia-Herzegovina, from Rwanda, from Cambodia, and many other programs that we have covered. Allie wants to know if there's some action we can take to help protect human rights in our communities. Absolutely. I'm always a big fan of the Think Global, Act Local. These norms and mechanisms are often not fully understood, and it's the first thing I would say is to get the information out there. Make sure that everyone is informed that these rights exist and that they are ours, and that they are not selective, and they are not something that you may enjoy over here, but you can't enjoy over there. But also, I think being a mindful ally, recognizing that the rights that we may have and enjoy are not equally had and enjoyed, even within our local communities. So reaching out and thinking about various organizations and ways that you can be a force for positive change with one H, but possibly by working with change with two H's, is a really great possible solution and avenue for meaningful action. It's so funny, I introduced the idea of human rights during the idea of individual rights in the internet. And I knew it was going to mean that somebody asked me a question about it. And it's one that I am so poorly equipped to answer. But Nicole asks, how do we protect human rights in the virtual age, especially with artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, as seen with the Uyghurs in China? Honestly, this is like trying to chase a moving target and wrap your hands around smoke. It has been real, and unfortunately, I will note that with every single, and these are all tremendous modern technological gains, but with every single one, new complications emerge when it comes to protecting the rights of individuals who should be able to enjoy the internet without having their data mined or used against them, as is the example of the Uyghurs in China. At the same time, with the internet, and this is something that you'll hear many of the tech barons, as it were, argue, it's your choice to use it. And so you're entering into some sort of modified contract, if you will. If you use it, you're already subjecting some of your data to being mined because you're using it as a free resource that is accessible to you. I find this to be extremely problematic. And I'll even introduce a further complication. What do we do when people use the internet and internet resources in order to perpetrate genocide? What do we do when satellite technology is used to locate dense populations, for example, of Rohingya Muslims, and that's then used by the Burmese government in order to target them? So there are so many issues with so many of the tremendous technological advances that have been made in the world, and we're kind of going at lightning speed these days. oftentimes the laws and regulations and how we enumerate them, when we think about the fact that the UDHR took years to draft and enter into force, we're always leading from behind or reactive. It's very hard to be proactive when thinking about this moving target. And so that's my non-answer. How is that? All right. Well, I'm really appreciative to everyone who joined us on this Lunch and Learn. I'm very thankful to my staff, to Nicole and Allie for helping to make this a reality. I'm thankful to Dale and Susan for helping with drafts, and I'm very thankful to all of you for participating and continuing to join us with our virtual programming. We're in the process right now of designing what fall is going to look like, and so please stay tuned. There's going to be a tremendous amount of initiatives coming from us, and you will be able to benefit from them from the comfort of your home. So take care, be well. Thank you again for being here, and virtual hugs to everyone.